Michael Lemnick's talk, How a Failed Astrophysics Major Became a Successful Science Writer. Well, he'll talk a little bit about how he got his job. And in terms of background, he was at Harvard. He was first an astrophysics major, then got a D- on a test, and he switched to economics. And then he went to Columbia to study journalism. Since then, he's worked at a number of venues, most prominently Time magazine, where he's published hundreds of articles, including over 50 cover issues. So 50, basically a year's worth of Time magazine is kind of due to Michael Lemnick. Now he teaches science journalism at Princeton University, and he's published this book. He came partly here for the Science Festival. It's called The Perpetual Now, A Story of Amnesia, Memory, and Love. It's on sale at Acapella Books. And please, so there will be no slides tonight. He's just gonna give you a vulnerable, authentic writer's presentation of everything he has. So let's welcome him one last time. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I see that things have not changed since I was in college. Nobody in the first two rows. This is very natural and familiar. David gave away one of my good lines, but that's okay. I have more, and I don't know if I'll tell you all I have because how much time do we have here anyway? But I will fulfill the promise or the threat of the title, because I was indeed a failed astrophysics major as an undergraduate, and it's a how shall I say, a harrowing tale of disaster and lack of self-understanding, and it turned out okay. So that's the punchline. But I find that when I talk about this to my own students, because I always kind of like to tell them where I came from, to be the person standing in front of them in classes, and I sometimes give talks to journalism students and students of all kinds, and many of them find it very reassuring, because the fact that I had a terrible time in college and a terrible time for a while after, and was a complete lost soul, and it looked like we were heading for disaster, and then I finally figured out what my life should be about after quite a few years. It's very reassuring to undergraduates who don't know what they want or what they're going to do, and they're undecided, and they worry that their friends have this great career path laid out in front of them, and they're applying to law school or business school or whatever. They're having interviews for consulting firms, and somebody even in this audience might be thinking, oh, but what about me? I have no idea. It all looks downhill from here. So maybe you will take a lesson that it's not necessarily all downhill from here. Although in my case, this bizarre path that I took, it could have turned out very badly. So the fact that I'm even here talking to you is an indication that it all worked out. But anyway, at the time, there was no reason to think that it did. So what I'm going to do is talk for a while and live up to the promise of the title, and then I will be very tired of myself talking, and maybe you will be too, and I will be open to questions, and then if there are no questions, I will start talking again. So that's your warning. Take notes, think of things to ask me, so that you won't have to listen to me drone on forever. Okay. So not only did I become, so I was a failed astrophysics major, certified, it's right there in my record, and not only did I become a science writer with some success, but I'm also listed in the Princeton faculty as a visiting lecturer in astrophysics, which is pretty funny. I also served on the visiting committee that comes to observe and comment on the curriculum of the astrophysics department at Harvard, where I failed as an undergraduate, and also in the visiting committee for the astrophysics department at Princeton. So it gets crazier all the time. but it all makes sense, I hope, by the end. So we will start when I am a young child, a very young child, and my father was a professor of physics. He ended up at Princeton University, and he was on the faculty there for probably 40 years before he retired. And the thing about my father was that you have never heard of him, almost certainly, because he was no Stephen Hawking. He did not come up with fantastic new theories to explain cosmic phenomena. He didn't discover any new particles. He was an elementary particle physicist. And one reason for that is that he was, early in his career, he made the transition from being a physics teacher and a physics researcher to being an administrator. He became a dean. But he was a gifted teacher. And by that I mean that, first of all, he was passionate about his topic. He loved physics. He loved the idea that human beings who just, a couple million years ago, we were walking around naked and eating raw food because we didn't know how to make fire and hitting each other with stones. And somehow these sort of ape-like creatures evolved to the point where we can talk about what's happening far below our ability to see in terms of the microscopic and the submicroscopic and the subatomic and figuring out what's going on down there, even though we have no senses that can actually perceive it. And also that we can look up into the sky, and our cave-dwelling ancestors would look up there and they would see lights and they had no idea what they were, and they made up gods and all sorts of things, but that we got to the point where we could actually look at the sun and look at the stars and look at the galaxies and look all the way to the edge of the universe and figure out what was going on completely beyond our sight. So he thought that was the most incredible thing, and he was excited by it always, and he took that excitement into the classroom. And so when I still, to this day, have old men with gray hair, older than me with more gray hair than I have, come up to me and say, I had your father for physics in 1962. He was the best teacher I ever had. And this literally happened as recently as a couple weeks ago. So not only was he really passionate about it and had a lot of energy, and you could tell that he just loved this stuff, but he was incredibly good at explaining things and making them seem as exciting to other people as they were to him. And so he could talk to senior faculty about physics and get them excited. He could talk to graduate students, talk to undergraduate students. He could talk to high school students. And he could even talk to a 4 or 5-year-old kid who happened to be his son, and get that little kid excited about the awe and the majesty and the spectacular stuff going on in the universe at the very largest scales and the very smallest scales. And the way he did it, you may guess, or you could guess if you had time to think about it, he did not make me do any math. At 5 years old, he did not make me solve any problem sets. We didn't go into the lab and have me, measure accelerations. He did not have me write up lab reports or read physics textbooks because I was 5 years old. What he did was, as a gifted teacher, he pitched his explanations to the level of the audience. So he did not talk over people. He did not talk under people, and what he did was to tell me stories about what we've discovered about the universe and how we know it and what we still don't know. And it was the most exciting thing to me. He once told me the story of Halley's Comet. Are you all familiar with that? It was big in the 80s. Yes? Anybody? Okay. Some of you are familiar with it. Anyway, it's this comet that was discovered, I don't even know how long ago, but in the 1500s or the 1600s, I could look it up, somebody calculated that this object that had been seen before was actually the same object, and it was orbiting around, and it came back through the inner solar system, and it lit up, and it had a long tail, and somebody predicted, I think it was Halley who predicted, that it would return again 76 years after its last appearance, and then he died, but sure enough, it appeared, and every 76 years it comes back. But that's the science part. But then there was the romantic part. So Halley's Comet was in the sky when Mark Twain was born, the year Mark Twain was born. And it was back again the year he lay on his deathbed. And he died at the age of 76. And sure enough, it came back that year. And that was 1910, I believe, yes. And so it's so romantic. This thing comes back to light up the sky, and it's the bookend of Mark Twain's life. And the best part, my father told me, was it's going to come back again in 1986. And in 1910, it was spectacular, and it was just the most amazing thing. So just wait. And we're now talking in 1960, this was, when I was 7 years old, maybe. He was telling me about this. So it's like 1986. That's forever. It'll never come. And how old will I be? I can't remember how old I was, but I was a lot older than I could conceive of being. And I was inspired. I was just inspired to learn about the sky. And I would read popular books about astronomy. And the frustrating part for me was that, at the time at least, all the popular books about astronomy did the whole history of astronomy. So the first chapter was, this is what the Babylonians believed. We were on the backs of turtles. I don't remember, but it was that kind of stuff. And then this is what the Sumerians believed, and then this is what the Greeks, and then the Romans, and by the time we were 3/4 of the way through the book, we're at Isaac Newton. So we're still hundreds of years ago. And finally, we got to the very last thin chapter, and this is modern astronomy. And this is what we know today. Well, I wanted to know a lot more about what we know today and what we don't understand, the mysterious things that we don't understand. I remember in one of those books, there were pictures of objects. There's your galaxy, and there's your planet, and we didn't have telescopes like we have today, so they were all kind of blurry. But on the last page, there was this weird, bright object seemed like had a jet of light coming out of it. And this was something called a quasar. It was a thing so bright that it could be seen billions of light years away. But it was really tiny, a pinpoint of light, so it was very concentrated. Nobody at the time had any idea what it could be. What is this beacon of incredible light that shines all the way across the universe? And in a few years they figured it out, but that mystery was what really grabbed me. So it was the romance of what we know, but also the mystery of what we are going to find out, or what we don't know, what we wonder about. So I was very into it, frustrated by those books. So then I'd get the next book out, and Babylonians again. So I had to endure that. There was not, at the time, a lot of news about science in the media. And by media, I mean newspapers, magazines, and one of 3 television networks that never ran science news. Anyway, I knew at that point that I was going to be an astronomer. I mean, what else would you be when you were captivated by the mysteries of the heavens? We hadn't been to the moon at that point. The best pictures we had of the moon were very blurry, and the close-ups. So we didn't really know what the moon was like. We didn't really know what the planets were like. Mars was this blob. And over the next few years, during the 1960s, of course, we sent people to the moon, and we had close-up photographs of the footprints, and we sent probes out to Mars and to Jupiter and to all the planets, and all this amazing stuff started coming in, all these mysteries about, when we sent people to the moon, there were a number of scientists who thought that the moon was probably covered with a very deep layer of dust, and that when the astronauts landed, they would just sink into the dust like quicksand. And there was people actually worried about that. Well, so it didn't happen. That was good. But that was another mystery, and then they solved that mystery. So I was going to be an astronomer, and because I wanted to learn of these amazing secrets of the universe and probe deeper than anybody ever probed before. And of course, in elementary school and middle school and high school, you had to take science. It was not an option. And I was going to be a scientist, so this should have been a great fit. Except that I hated every science class I ever took. The textbooks were boring, the lectures were boring, the lab exercises were annoying. I did have to do those things my father didn't make me do. Measure, you drop something, you measure the acceleration, and you figure out if Isaac Newton was right about gravity. I think he was. I think we knew that, but we had to do those things. Or in biology class, I remember you had to cut up a frog to see what was inside. So, first of all, that's disgusting. Secondly, I didn't care what was inside a frog. I honestly just didn't care. And third, if I really did care, I could look it up. I didn't have to take a knife and chop it apart. So that was my attitude towards science and science classes. And that continued right through high school. And physics class was no better. And chemistry class was worse because I had a crotchety old teacher. But I was going to be an astronomer. This was a constant. And I knew that when I got to college, the veil would be lifted and I would be dealing with the mysteries of the universe. Now, this wasn't perhaps very thoughtful, because I probably could have found out. Again, my father was a physics professor, and I could have gone to his classes, I guess, and see what it was actually like. It was not romantic. Even though he was a great teacher, there was still a lot of math. But I got to college, and I'm going to sign up for astrophysics. So to do that, to major in astrophysics, you had to take the introductory physics course that physics majors and astrophysics majors all had to take. And I went to the class, I got the textbook, and to my surprise, and so I should tell you right now that this, I think I told you in the introduction, or I meant to, that this is, part of this was an exercise in profound lack of self-knowledge, because I managed to kid myself that I would fall in love with this eventually. And in fact, I blame my father for this too, because he said, you'll go to college and you'll fall in love with a subject and you'll become passionate about it, which is what had happened to him. So he assumed it would happen to me. And so I went to this physics class, and it was just like my classes in high school, except much harder. So the math was harder, and the lab exercises were more complicated. And lab reports had to be done just so. And they were kind of awful. And the lectures and all of it. And the problem is that there are many of you here who might have had classes that you didn't really enjoy very much, but you're here and you're going to do your best. You don't care. You might not like it, but you're going to do the homework and you're going to do the best you can. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I'm sure you're out there. But I wasn't like that. So I just couldn't make myself do it. I had a very low tolerance for boredom. I'm beginning to sound like a pretty lame person, but bear with me. And the thing I had also learned going through elementary school and all the education before that, and even in my writing course as an undergraduate, I turned out, for some reason, I was pretty good at writing. Writing, not fiction, because I didn't have that much imagination, but explaining stuff. So if explanatory prose, I had a feeling for, and maybe I inherited that from my father, who was great at explaining things. But so what? So I can write papers for my classes, but this has nothing to do with anything I would do in real life. So anyway, we got to the end of the first semester of the physics course, and we had the final exam. And in my university, the final exams were 3 hours long, and the rule was that you had to sit there for at least the first half. So you worked on the exam for an hour and a half, and then you took a break, and then you had another hour and a half. But after the break, you could leave whenever you were finished. You couldn't leave before that. So I sat down, and I opened up the booklet, and I looked at the first problem, and I started working on it. And I worked on every problem that I could and got all the answers I could. And I looked at my watch, 10 minutes had gone by. I was done, and not in a good way. But I had to sit there for the next hour and 20 minutes, because you couldn't leave, and everybody's furiously scribbling, and I'm kind of pretending to scribble. And then the half-hour point comes, the halfway point comes. Okay, it's break. Officially, you're now allowed to leave. But of course, who would leave? This is a physics exam. I got up, and I walked out of the room. And everybody just followed me. Wow, he must be so smart. He finished the thing in half the time. But when the results came back, you heard it, they didn't want to be mean and give me a failing grade, so they gave me a D-, which is basically a failing grade. And my father, the physics professor, in those days, they sent all the grades home to your parents. So I couldn't hide it very well. And he was not happy. I actually went back and did the second semester of this course, and I brought my grade up to a C-, which was a big relief, because I could have done worse. But it was clear that if I was doing this badly on the very most elementary course, I was not. It just wasn't going to happen. There was no way I was going to be an astrophysicist. So that is why I'm called a failed. I call myself a failed astrophysicist, because I tried, not very hard, and I failed miserably. So then the question is, I've been my whole life, my whole conscious life, I've been looking forward to becoming an astronomer, and it simply was not going to happen. It was not possible, and I finally accepted this. So the question is, now what, right? So I had no plan B. There was no thing that I was secondarily interested in. And in fact, I took a year off to try and figure it out, and I came back and I hadn't figured it out. And what I decided was, I think I'll major in economics. I've never taken a course in economics. I'm now a junior in college, but the requirements are manageable, and maybe it'll be really interesting, and it's a good career kind of degree to have. So I took Intro to Economics my fall of my junior year, and I didn't like it much. But at this point, I had to. I just had to finish and get out. So I gritted my teeth and I passed the courses, not with very high grades, and I graduated with a degree in a field that I wasn't interested in, I wasn't very good in, and I could never have a career in. And I couldn't get a recommendation for grad school or for a job because none of my professors would say nice things about me because I was just completely nondescript. And anyway, so this is not sounding good, I hope you realize. And because I did not have the advantage of the perspective I have now, I could see my life spiraling downhill in a very bad way. And so there's this phenomenon that's, of course, very familiar nowadays where students graduate from college and they can't find a job, so they move into their parents' basement, right? You've heard of this. I invented that. I was a pioneer. So in the 1970s, I moved into my parents', not literally the basement, but, and I got a job delivering liquor for a liquor store, and then I got another job driving a truck for educational testing service, driving the scores from the place where they were printed over to the post office. It was not very challenging. And during that time, I really realized that this is not a life I wanted for myself, and all my friends were going to graduate school and law school, and they were on Wall Street making millions or thousands at least, which is still a lot from my perspective, and I was driving a truck. And by that point, I'd kind of thought, well, maybe I can become a writer. That sounds very romantic, and then you could be famous or something. Still not a lot of self-knowledge, but what would I write about? I didn't know. And I finally moved up in the world. I got a job at a small publishing company as a proofreader because while I had nothing to offer as a scientist and nothing really to offer as a writer because I had nothing to write about, I was really good at spelling. So I passed that test and I was hired, but I had greater aspirations. And so what happened next, and when I say next, I'm now 25, 26 years old, was that something completely external to me happened. The universe decided to take pity on me. And we're now in the late 1970s, and suddenly, out of nowhere, remember I thought, I'm interested in science, I have some ability to write, but so what? The two have nothing to do with each other. And almost like magic in the late 1970s, the field of science journalism suddenly emerged from obscurity to be everywhere. The New York Times, which has a science section every Tuesday, created that section at that time. So did the Washington Post. They had a section. So did the San Francisco Chronicle. Newspapers suddenly started creating science sections. And a number of science magazines were also founded at that time. So if you've heard of Discover magazine, yes, some people are nodding, it was invented at exactly that time. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the professional organization for scientists in the US, created its own popular magazine. Another magazine was founded, a couple others. And remember, I had always been frustrated to read those books, and I get the little thin chapter at the end of the mysteries that we don't know. Well, that's what all these magazines were about. That's all they were about. There were no frogs to cut up. There were no stories about going to the lab and trying to recreate Newton's laws of gravity. By definition, these were news outlets, so you had to write about something new. So all of these magazines, all these newspapers wrote about the newest things happening in science, the leading edge of research, the things we're just discovering, the mysteries that we're just solving, and I ate it up. This is what I had been looking for since I was 5 years old. These were not told as reports or dry kind of lists of, I don't know, statistics or something. These were stories. They started out with, I remember one from one of my favorites, the reporter's up on the top of a mountain with an astronomer, and the astronomer is gazing up at the sky, and he sees the stars. It's a beautiful night, clear night in Arizona or someplace, and he sees the stars, and then you can see the glow, the faint glow of the Andromeda galaxy, the nearest major galaxy to ours, and he's looking at all this stuff, and this is the writer's describing this, and he knows that what he's looking at is not what the universe is mostly made of, because there's a growing understanding that there's some kind of stuff out there that we call dark matter, because we don't know what it is. It's dark and mysterious, and it's also, it doesn't shine. There's no way to observe it directly. And yet there's so much of it that it weighs 6 or 7 times as much as all the stars and galaxies we can see. Everything we can see is kind of an impurity in the real universe, and nobody knows what this stuff is, and we're going to try and find out. We know it's there because its gravity pulls on the stuff we can see. So galaxies are spinning faster than they should. They should fly apart unless they're surrounded by a cloud of dark matter that holds them together. And other evidence. I just loved it. It was romantic. It was exciting. It was a mystery. It was science. It was making discoveries about things that we hadn't even suspected were there. And at one point, finally, now remember, I was significantly older than most of you at this point. I was in my sort of the second half of my 20s, and a light bulb went on in my head. I was a slow learner. A light bulb went on in my head. Wait a minute. Science, writing, that's how they come together in exactly the kind of way that is most exciting to me. So I'm going to be a science journalist, of course. I'm going to write about astronomy. I'm going to go to the mountaintop and interview the astronomers and stay up all night, which by the way, even though I did finally get to the mountaintop, I never managed to stay up all night. I have a reputation among professional astronomers. He's the guy who goes to bed at midnight because he just can't handle it. Okay, so I have some family connections because my father's a physicist, and I sort of wheedle my way into conversations with some journalists, say, well, how do I do this? How do I go about this? And they said, well, you know, one thing you can do is just try and get an entry-level job. So I knocked on a lot of doors, and I said, I want to write about science for you. I could really be good at this. And they said, kid, your enthusiasm is great. What can you show me as evidence? Did you take any journalism courses in college? No, we didn't have any of those. Did you write for the college paper? No, because I didn't know about science journalism, and I wasn't interested in the other stuff. Did you write for the high school paper? No. Do you have a degree in science? No, I don't have it. I didn't tell them I failed astrophysics. That seemed to be too much honesty. But they basically all said, you know, you're a nice kid, and we love your enthusiasm and your confidence. Get the heck out of here until you have something to show us, not just your confidence. Don't come back. So that was kind of depressing. But also, it was a reality check. Why would they hire me if I have nothing but my own confidence? And so I went away again and talked to more people, and a bunch of them said, well, you know, you should go to graduate school for journalism and focus on science. And I thought, well, it's school, and my experiences with school haven't been so great of late, but it sounds like a really promising thing. And the truth was, I was very confident, but I wasn't certain that I'd be good at this. You know, confidence is helpful, but doesn't guarantee anything. So I applied to grad school for journalism at Columbia in New York. And now you may remember, so when you apply to grad school in anything, you have to get recommendations. Well, nobody in my undergraduate institution would even know who I was, literally. And they certainly wouldn't give me, oh yes, this guy got a C- in my course. Thumbs up. It was not a good idea. But fortunately, I was far enough away from my undergraduate school far away enough in time that it didn't seem weird, even though it was weird, that I didn't submit any recommendations from undergrad. What I did do, because I realized I had to be clever about this, is I went out and got a part-time job at a local small newspaper, because they would hire anybody. And also, I had a connection. So, I mean, it was... so I got this job, and I was covering school board meetings and municipal government meetings in small towns. You know, the process of purchasing a garbage truck is much more... Well, no, it's no more interesting than you think. It's really dull. Or the school budget and how much... but I had to do this stuff. And I had some pieces published in this newspaper. So now I had some evidence for the grad school that I was serious about journalism. And I had got a recommendation from my editor, because I really wanted to succeed. So I worked hard at these stories about things that weren't that interesting. And he said, yeah, this kid is great. He's going to go places. So he wrote this letter for me. And I took a night course at NYU in journalism. And I made friends with the instructor. And we went out for a beer after class. And I told him about my ambitions. And so he wrote me a recommendation. And I forget who the third person was. But it was also somebody, I know, a very well-known journalist for the New Yorker magazine, a guy named John Mcphee, who wrote sometimes about science. And he was my hero. I got an introduction to him, and he found out, so this is how life works. He found out that I worked as a proofreader, and he happened to have one of his books that was just being published, and he would always proofread it himself because he didn't trust the proofreaders at the publishing company. He was a perfectionist. He said, well, you know what? Why don't you work for me as a proofreader? So I got the galleys for his book. I never worked so hard and so carefully at anything in my life, because here's my hero, here's my chance to show him that I'm worth something. And it turns out that I found many more errors than the publisher's proofreader did. So I was golden, and I did a couple books for him, and I went to him, I said, I'm applying to grad school, will you write me a recommendation? This was pretty audacious, because he was already pretty famous. But he was also very generous. So he said, I can't write a recommendation about your journalism, because I've never seen it. You've never done any. But I will write you a reference anyway. And I guess, I don't know what he said, but I think he said, boy, this guy is a hell of a speller. He can spell words. I don't know what he said. But the fact that he said anything was very impressive. And so they took me, even though they probably shouldn't have. And I was also, again, very focused on this career, which I'd really decided I wanted. And we did not know yet if I'd be any good at it. Fortunately, I turned out to be good enough that I did okay in journalism school, and I made friends with the professor, the science journalism professor, and by going to grad school, I learned a bit about how to do it properly, but I also got a piece of paper that people took seriously, and I got a network of former graduates who are out there in the world, and who are favorably inclined to alumni. And you probably already know this, but the alumni network in almost any field that you choose to go into can be really valuable, because they get 100 emails from people who want to talk to them about their career. But if you come from Georgia Tech and they went here, they like you already. Anyway, so as by the time I graduated, and thank goodness it worked out, because remember, astrophysics was plan A, didn't work out. Economics was plan B, didn't work out. If this was now plan C. If this didn't work out, I'm not entirely sure what would have happened, but I probably would not be here talking to you. There was an opening for a job at a science magazine. One of the members of the previous year's class had been promoted, and his job was open. He called his old professor and said, "Do you have any students you recommend?" And he said, "Oh yes, this Lemonick fellow, he's top notch," or something. So they sent me down, and I got this job, and I began working for one of those science magazines I told you about. It was called Science Digest. How many people here have heard of Science Digest? Oh, I always do this. No, you haven't. You are completely wrong. It went out. You might. Some of the older people might. It went out of business in 1986, and it was never very well known before it went out of business. So you're probably thinking of something else. Reader's Digest. You might be thinking of Reader's Digest or something. But it was a science magazine, and it was a national science magazine, and so I started writing for them. And I would sometimes go on trips to interview people, and it was on the newsstand at the airports. It was always in the back row, and Discover magazine, which was really the good one, was always in the front row. So I would take copies of my magazine and put it in front of Discover to try and boost sales somewhat. But it was a real magazine, and I was really in this profession, and I was actually doing what I had always dreamed of. I went to a mountaintop with some astronomers doing some cutting-edge research, and I went to bed at midnight. But before midnight, I learned what an astronomer actually does, what it's like to be in that dome, looking at the monitor and stepping outside and looking at the sky, and it was just great. It was just incredible, and they explained to me what they were doing. It was just fascinating. And it was cutting-edge stuff. And after 3 years there, at Science Digest, I heard about an opening at Time magazine, which people, so when I was at Science Digest, I would call up a scientist and say, "Hello, I'm a reporter from Science Digest." And they would say, "What?" I said, "Science Digest. What's that?" So I had to explain it was a science magazine, and they would usually talk to me, but not always. So I'm not going to go through the whole song and dance about time, but through a series of weird coincidences, I got this job at Time magazine. And people had heard of that. And so when you call up from Time magazine and say, I'd like to interview you for Time, they dropped whatever they were doing. There was an enormous amount of exposure and prestige. It's less prestigious now, I think. I don't think people read it nearly as much. But at the time, it was a big deal. And so all of these things happen, and I have the 2-hour version of this talk, which I will not subject you to. But the number of sort of coincidences and I'll just give you two very quickly. The same friend of mine who opened up the job at Science Digest was now at the Los Angeles Times, and he called me up. He said, "I hear there's an opening at Time for a science writer." And I knew enough to pick up the phone immediately, hang up, pick up the phone immediately, not wait a minute, maybe 15 seconds, and call Time magazine and reach the science desk and say, I hear you have a job opening. And the secretary said, yes, well, send us your resume, we'll be in touch, which basically means forget it, not going to talk to you. A minute later, the phone rings. I answer, it is the science editor himself, who overheard the conversation and said, "Who is that?" And she told him. And he said, "Oh, I'm calling him back." And he called me back and he said, "I know your work." I'm thinking, no, I don't think so. You must be. Well, it turns out that I wrote about the things, astronomy and physics, that he cared most about. And he had been the founding editor of Discover magazine, and so we were at a sort of a competitor. So he read the competition. No other way in a million years would the editor of Time have been familiar with my work, but he was, and he liked it, and he asked me a couple of questions, and he said, "Are you a fast writer?" And I said, "Yes," which was actually true. I would have said yes anyway, but it was actually true. And so I started to work there and started writing about science every week for this major national magazine, and people were actually reading it, and they'd heard of it. And I was there after a year. I was there, and a star exploded in the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is a satellite galaxy of the Milky Way, and it was the closest. This is called a supernova, and it's a really important event in astronomy. We just don't see them that often. In fact, the last one we saw in our own galaxy, even closer by, happened about 10 years before Galileo first pointed a telescope at the sky. So there were no telescopic observations. This was relatively close. It was a big deal for astronomy, and I ended up writing my first cover story about it, which was just an incredible thrill. And then I wrote another one about superconductivity, and another one about beach erosion. As the science writer, I had to write about all different topics. But astronomy was my favorite, and I got to do that fairly often. Anyway, so that satisfies the promise of the talk. This is how a failed astrophysics major became reasonably successful. I should have put reasonably in the title because that's a little more, it sounds a little bit more, less egotistical, but reasonably successful. So, I was there for 21 years, wrote those 50 cover stories, moved on after that to a smaller organization, a nonprofit, that did climate change research and journalism. So I was writing about climate, which I cared a lot about. I had first written about that in 1987 also. And it turned out that they were badly organized, and they were and the editor, the managing editor of the news website was a truly horrifying and evil person. So we didn't get along because I was a very nice person. And finally, I had to leave there, and I ended up at